This is Dr. Sandler. Welcoming you again to Stand History Man. Today we're going to finish up or continue Pearl Harbor and the terrible. We start with the disaster, of course, Pearl Harbor, the biggest single defeat in American military history. But in a way, the Japanese may have lost on that day of Pearl Harbor because they sank battleships, old battleships, and not aircraft carriers. They missed the oil tank farms. They did not hit the repair facilities. So all but two of those battleships were restored. That two were the Oklahoma, which capsized, and the Arizona, of course, was the biggest single ship disaster in American naval history. But the bad news was just continuing after Pearl Harbor. Terrible bad news in the Pacific. The First of all, the Japanese, on the very same day as they attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked the Philippines. And General MacArthur was in charge of the Filipino-American forces on the Philippines, and he really, I think, goofed up here. He expected the Philippine forces, which were very weak, they had very few weapons and not much training. Then you have helmets. Their helmets are made out of like lacquered bamboo or some kind of leaf thing. It's not much, just kept the sun off them, basically. We're supposed to stop the Japanese landings, and where he put the forces, the Japanese landed somewhere else. So it was complete fiasco. And the Japanese then moved down the island of Luzon, and MacArthur tried to stop them, but again, he made some terrible mistakes. Thousands, tens of thousands of tons of rice were destroyed. And so by the time the Americans got into the Bataan Peninsula, they were on starvation, half rations almost from the start. We had to evacuate Manila, which was bombed by the Japanese. And then the pre-war idea was for the Japanese, if they attack, we will retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, just south of Manila. And there they held out, the so-called battling bastards of Bataan. No father, no mother, no Uncle Sam, and nobody gives a damn. MacArthur became known as Dugout Doug. Incredibly, he visited his troops in the line on Bataan Peninsula only once. Now, there's not reflection on MacArthur's courage. He was often out there. He was on the island of Corregidor, the fortified island of Corregidor, and he'd often go out to watch the Japanese bombing Corregidor. But for some reason, he didn't know. Corregidor was a small island off the Bataan coast, but he never, only once did he go back to Bataan to, supposedly encourage the troops. So a lot of troops didn't think that highly of MacArthur, but he was played up at home, the great hero. He's holding off the Japanese. I mean, this is great. Little realizing just how some of the bad mistakes he'd made. In fact, I should have mentioned earlier. On the day after Pearl Harbor, we had our own Pearl Harbor, the Philippines. His Air Force, the Philippine Air Forces in the Philippines, were based mostly at Clark Field, and the Japanese hit Clark Field when the troops, the pilots, were literally out to lunch. The planes, B-17s, P-40s, lined up wingtip to wingtip while the pilots were in the mess hall, and the Japanese couldn't believe their luck. And obviously bad intelligence, not good a warning system. So they caught us. And by the time it was over, we had about, 3 B-17s left and maybe 5 P-40s. And most of those were shot. I think by the end of the campaign, we had like 2 P-40s left, and that was all full of holes. So that was another disaster, which is inexplicable. No one can tell why it was that MacArthur and his air commander, Brereton, left the aircraft on the ground. They have all kinds of different explanations for it, which I won't go into here, but it's one of the great mysteries, which like Pearl Harbor itself. How the heck could they catch us on the ground? The Roosevelt said the two on the ground, okay? And anyway, that was our troubles were beginning. The Philippines. Finally, the Japanese took the Bataan Peninsula, and what was left of our forces retreated to Corregidor, and they were held out until May of 1942. So I would say this, although we were badly defeated, it's the greatest single defeat in our history. We put up a pretty good fight, all right, even though the troops were literally half rations, half starving, terrible beriberi and malaria and so on. We did keep on fighting, although it should be pointed out, we outnumbered, if you add the Filipinos and the U.S. forces, we outnumbered the Japanese, but that's the Filipino. I mean, they were brave and courageous and all, but they just weren't, that well trained and didn't have that equipment. One thing we did have was heavy guns. We had a number of heavy guns, which did give the Japanese a hard time. Mobile 155 millimeter cannon, and then the great guns on Fort Drum, the Army's so-called concrete battle. Let me just get you. I should have this ready. Let me get you show you a model of Fort Drum, which I made. This is Fort Drum, the Army's concrete battleship, okay? It was actually made of concrete, and it was, try to get this in here for you. Don't have my head in the way either. I made it myself out of plaster of Paris. And you can see the guns, the two big guns, they're 12 inchers. And for a while, they were the biggest guns fighting any of our enemies in World War II, okay? But they were trapped as well in Fort Drum. Actually, not a single casualty, not a single American was even badly injured at Fort Drum. But with the surrender of the Philippines and surrender of Corregidor in early May of 1942, Fort Drum had to surrender as well. It's still there, okay? It's just so big and so solid concrete. The scrap merchants have taken away most of the metal there, but it's they can't get rid of it. It's sort of a navigation hazard in Manila Bay. And of course, that was designed figuring the Japanese would come by sea, and then the guns on Corregidor and Fort Drum would have it out with them, duke it out. But it didn't work that way. The Japanese came by land. And of course, they had complete control of the air, thanks to that fiasco early, our own Pearl Harbor in the Philippines. They controlled the skies. The Japanese also landed on Guam and Wake Island. At least at Wake Island, the Marines put up a good fight. And I keep emphasizing good fight because at the same time, the Japanese attacked all other Western facilities in their territory in the Pacific. That is Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and they'd already taken over French Indochina. And the Malaya was a really sad story. The Philippines were the worst defeat in American military history, and so was Malaya. And by Malaya, basically, I'm talking about Singapore, which is the end of Malaya. And in Malaya also, the big guns there were designed to fire out the sea, to stop Japanese battleships from coming in. Well, the Japanese didn't conveniently come in by battleship. They came down by land, okay, from the north. And every place they met the British, they defeated them. It was a real fiasco. The British didn't even fight that well. One of the major reasons why was they had a commander, General Percival. And Percival was a kind of general, had always had his ducks in a row. He made wonderful staff reports, and the troops got their pay on time, their allowances and their uniforms and all. The troops liked him, but he just wasn't a fighter, and he had no charisma at all. Charisma. Well, he was certainly had none of that, and he just kind of and pessimistically, we're just going to keep retreating and retreating. And he made all kinds of wrong decisions. The Japanese would come in here, and they came in there, and they put up roadblocks to stop them. Well, the Japanese just went around the roadblocks it was all jungle, impenetrable jungle. That's why they didn't bother to defend Malaya from the land side. It wasn't impenetrable jungle. It was mostly rubber plantations. And the Japanese just pushed their way through the rubber plantation to bicycles. And again, the British outnumbered the Japanese, but they finally got to Singapore itself. And by that time, Percival was defeated. But he said, okay, we'll try to hold them out. But the Japanese, of course, again had control of the air. The P4, the Hurricanes, which had done so well in the Battle of Britain, were just completely outclassed by the Japanese Zero. We tried to help by sending them earlier Brewster Buffaloes, flown by Australians, and they were just shot right out of the sky. So it was a fiasco. And when Singapore surrendered as early as February 15th, 1942, it was the greatest military disaster in British military history. Okay, even Churchill said, "What's the matter with these guys? The Americans seem to be holding out." Said this privately, seem to be holding out in the Philippines, but we just seem to surrender. And these were good troops. These were British troops. They were Australian troops, which have a reputation for being very good fighters in North Africa. There was one Australian division that was so badly managed that the troop ship landed and the troops got off and hardly got their land legs when they surrendered. They were on the ground for about 4 days when they had to surrender to the Japanese. And I've read Japanese accounts. They say, like, you guys surrendered already? I mean, you ready to throw in the towel? And the British, oh, yes, where do you want us to sign on here? And so it was really something like, I think 40,000 British troops, 30,000 British troops were captured. And there were scenes of panic and disorganization and looting. It's a very bad story. It does not reflect well on the British. And I'm not just trying to knock them down. They have very bad leadership in certainly in General Percival. As a matter of fact, one of his generals, a staff conference just before the end, said, "Well, at least we can say we've gone down with honor." But I mean, Percival said, "At least we can go down with honor." And the guy said, "We have no honor here. We're surrendering too quickly to people we should have at least held off." And so that most of them wound up, their troubles were just beginning. They wound up in Japanese prison camps under horrible conditions. As a matter of fact, one third of all Allied prisoners, not just Americans, well, the soft Americans, no, the British, the French, the Dutch, all, one third of them died in Japanese prison camps. And a lot of them just worked to death on the bridge over the River Kwai, that sort of thing. But so much of it was really a dumb decision on the part of the Japanese. I mean, they lost the war the day they brought the United States into it. Really, what they wanted was oil, tin, rubber, and how much of that is in Pearl Harbor or even in the Philippines? If they had taken the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch, I mean, there was no Dutch government. The Germans had taken that over. You had Dutch uh, colonial forces and some Dutch troops, but not an awful lot of them. Again, they were flying Brewster Buffaloes. But you see, the Dutch East Indies had the oil the Japanese needed. Oil so pure you didn't have to refine it. You better refine it, of course, but you could put it in ships' bunkers and it would be okay. So that would be enough to supply all Japan, the oil of the Dutch East Indies. All right. And then the rubber of Malaya. Okay, no rubber growing in any Japanese territory. The tin and just the rice from Burma, which fell along with Malaya. In fact, Burma wasn't part of Malaya until just before the war, so they got the rice as well, which they needed. All the things that Japan needed, they could have got by just taking those colonies. And again, do you think the Americans, we would send our boys to fight for British, French, and Dutch colonies? I mean, we protest. Oh, we protested when they took over the Dutch East. I'm sorry, the French Indochina. Oh, yes, you should stop that. You shouldn't be there. And we cut off our oil exports to Japan, but that's all we did. So the Japanese really should have figured out, okay, look, we take this stuff we really want here, kick the colonial powers out. We're the great heroes. We're, Asia for the Asiatics, and the Americans will just make a lot of noise. But then we go and take bomb Pearl Harbor. Well, to stop the Americans from interfering, but we probably would have interfered anyway. I mean, you think Hitler's invasion of Russia was a big mistake. This was even bigger, okay, because it led to the utter destruction of Japan, all right? So we went through a period from December 7th, 1941 to about August of 1942 of pure disaster. Every place we met the Japanese, we, the British, Canadians, were overwhelmed. But what about the Canadians? Well, they had a garrison in Hong Kong. And again, in one of the most boneheaded decisions the Canadian government ever made, they kept those troops there. And they should have realized the Japanese will roll right. It's like one brigade. And to be fair, they fought well. And the Japanese had a little more trouble than they imagined. But every single Canadian was either killed or captured at the fall of Hong Kong. So that was the disasters that we faced in the Pacific. Then to kind of increase our misery, in the Atlantic, the Japanese, the German U-boats were going up and down the East Coast, and the Germans called it their happy hour because they were shooting tankers down, they're sinking tankers right, left, and center. All these tankers coming up from Venezuela and from the Texas oil field by way of Louisiana were being sunk. They say the beaches of like North Carolina, where I live, were thick with the fuel oil, which had washed ashore from, imagine the pollution of this, from all these tankers. And we did nothing about it because we hadn't anticipated fighting the Germans right on our coastline here. So it's just kind of like if they saw a tanker, they sank it. And the Navy, that's one of the Navy's great in this period of great defeat, even in the Atlantic, we were doing very poorly that way. And these submarines ranged up and down the East Coast, supposedly into New York Harbor. The story goes that later in the war, a submarine was sunk and two German U-boat officers bobbed to the surface dead. So the intelligence guys wanted to get information from them. So they hooked them and brought them to the destroyer that sank them. And they went through their pockets, and one of them had 2 canceled tickets to a Broadway show. Now, that's a story. We don't know how true it is. We know they went up the St. Lawrence River. And supposedly, when they went into New York Harbor, they took photographs of the New York skyline. So that's the boldness of the happy hour that the Germans had. We finally got our act together and got some destroyers out there on the East Coast, and pretty well made it, stopped the German menace. As a matter of fact, the other thing was the cities along the East Coast, like Miami, would not dim their lights. And that's bad for commerce. You can't just have the city dark. So they use the backdrop, the bright lights of the American cities, Wilmington, Miami, as background for the targets. So they would make sure they hit their targets. So it was a bad time. It would be the lowest point. The only period I would say in American history that would approach this for just a lot of bad news, and mostly caused by incompetence and lack of preparation, would be the early years of the American Civil War, when the Confederates seemed to run all over us. So anyway, that I just wanted to. Those are the months after the Pearl Harbor disaster. Thanks for listening and viewing. This is Dr. Sandler. I look forward to talking with you soon. Bye bye.